Hello and welcome to That Nerd Thing, where we uncover the magical impact that fandoms have on our lives. I'm Morgan, and today's episode is going to be a little different. I have not done any preparation because I have one of my friends that I've known for so many years now. She is actually the one who told me to do a podcast, and she is going to have a conversation with me today about, I'm not really sure what. I know she has done a lot of preparation, but I am so excited to introduce Tamara Howell. Hi, Tamara.
Hi, Morgan. Thank you so much for having me onto your podcast. I can't wait to get started.
Me too. I'm so excited that you're on the podcast because I know you said you want to be on the show, but there isn't anything you're really nerdy about that you can talk about. And I thought that this would be a great opportunity to have you on because I really want to talk to you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for kind of breaking the rules for me a little bit as well, because I really am not nerdy enough to actually come on the show. So I really like this idea you had about what we're going to do today.
I do think you're nerdy. Maybe not in the ways that you might think a typical nerd is, but I definitely think you're a great fit for the show. To give listeners some background, I was feeling like I wanted to do an episode where I got to talk a little bit more. You know, it's a little self-indulgent. But I didn't want to just sit and talk to myself for 45 minutes because that felt kind of boring. And I don't know if anybody would actually want to listen to that. So I figured every so often I would have somebody from my life pop up on the show and we would just have a conversation and see where it goes. And I'm so excited to do that with Tamara today.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. It's very interesting because when I've been listening to you hosting the podcast, and how excited you are to talk to people and hear about their interests and what inspires them, and listening to your guests as well. Like, I really feel a sort of kinship with the values that are expressed, but I just don't have a particular thing that I'm so dedicated to. And so I kind of like that idea of like being nerdy, but not necessarily being a nerd. And that was the first thing that I wanted to ask you about, was really like, how do you define nerdiness?
Oh, I did not know how I would feel with questions being asked to me.
So I thought I'd just jump in.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful because I have no format today. So I'm like so nervous, by the way.
I do.
So if you are only listening and you're not watching on YouTube, Tamara just held up a notebook full of questions and preparation for today. So that's why I'm so glad that you're doing this interview. So nerdiness. I really think nerdiness is just that passion and excitement for something, anything, wanting to learn all about it, having passion, sharing it with others, and not caring what other people might think about it.
Yeah, how has that changed? When I was a kid, I feel like nerd was a term, like it wasn't as cool as it is now, you know? Like there's an identity that I feel like I want to be a nerd, you know? Whereas I feel like when I was little, maybe that didn't come across to me, that it was a sort of desirable identity necessarily. So has that changed over time? Is that something about age and maturity? What's that about?
I'm almost wondering if it's the internet and people having access to social media, of realizing that there are other people out there into all these nerdy things. Fan fiction has been huge. Podcasts have grown over the years. I think realizing that there's other people out there has really helped. I mean, yeah, me personally too. I remember being a nerd wasn't a cool thing. It was kind of embarrassing, honestly, if people would call you a nerd. And now it is cool to be a nerd, and you want to be a nerd to fit in with others. And I think people also see that nerds are having so much fun enjoying the things that they love.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you what you had noticed your guests had in common. But just before you answer, I want to share that when I did a bit of prep, I haven't listened to all of them, but I did listen to a few. And what I noticed was that excitement and that having fun and really like the enjoyment. And I don't know that we see that in a lot of other areas, you know? I don't see that everywhere. So what have you noticed your guests have in common? What's the common thread between every nerd that you've had on?
Passion, having fun, having passion, embracing who they are, and taking their passions and doing something with it in some area of their life. You know, they're either writing or starting a podcast or just really getting into a certain hobby and getting involved with a community.
I love that. Every time I've listened, what I've heard is like, I really loved this, So then I just thought I would make this out of it. And the strategy has almost just come from, well, I had this idea and then I just did it. And that's amazing how many people get stuck with things. And everyone that's come on your show is just, I like this thing, so I'm going to make a career out of it. You know, it's amazing, really.
Yeah. And what's so amazing is so many of them didn't really plan for it to be their career. It just sort of happened, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just don't think anyone told me as a child, like, you can make a living doing something you love. I actually distinctly remember a teacher saying, work is something you do because someone else won't do it for free.
Oh,
yes.
Interesting.
Right.
Wow.
Like, you get paid to do it because no one will do it for free. I think a lot of people grew up with that kind of, maybe not that explicitly, my 6th grade teacher, as he said it, but I think a lot of people kind of grew up with that. You have to go and have a job and then what you love is your hobby.
Right. Or people say not to make your hobby your job or you'll end up hating it. And I don't think that's true.
Well, how's that working out for you? Because this is like a thing that you clearly love. And are you still enjoying it?
Oh, I love this. I would say I would do it full time, but I don't think I could ever fully give up therapy. I do love doing therapy, but I would love if I could eventually make this some sort of job. I'm really trying to look at it as a hobby because the second I start thinking, okay, I need to figure out how to make this a business, I think knowing me and my personality, I'll get so obsessed with the details of that will make it not be fun. I'd rather it become a job organically if it does ever go that route. I'm really trying to stay in the present moment here just because I know I'm so future focused. But I love this. It's so much fun.
Is that different to what you were doing? Like, we've known each other a long time and through different various projects, and I have seen you have fun doing those projects, but this seems like a whole other level.
I know. I was thinking that the other day. I was like, when I was doing all of those different projects, I really enjoyed it in the moment. And now thinking back, I'm like, why did I enjoy that? It seems so silly looking at some of those things now. I don't really know what changed. Maybe it just never hit this level of excitement. But yeah, I was thinking that too. Like, I kind of left that entire online world behind and I don't miss it at all.
Do people know? Have you said anything about like what kind of things you did before? Or do you want to share with listeners like some of the projects that you have done before?
Yeah, I think I've sprinkled it in here and there, but I don't think I've shared it a lot. You know, I have my private practice where I do therapy. I've always done that. As of right now, I plan to always do that. I also was expanding a bit to offer courses, workshops, coaching in the areas of mindfulness, perfectionism, and burnout to help people live a life outside of work without feeling like they needed to sacrifice their achievements. And it really feels like that was the beginning of this, because I did always talk about embracing hobbies and creativities. And I did always mention how I'm a proud nerd, but I never really went beyond that.
You didn't say anything about the bundle. That was a big project that you did.
So I did something called the Mindful Professional Bundle, which was probably my favorite thing that I've done so far, like in that world of business. And that was basically a collection of courses and resources and workshops to help professionals learn how to live a more mindful and intentional life in all areas of their life. And that was really fun. And that's actually how I met Nicole from Fantasy Fangirls. I feel like that bundle and meeting Nicole really helped shape the podcast. But I will also have to say, I would have never done that bundle if it wasn't for you and your Therabundle. So Tamara, I feel like you're the true origin story of this podcast.
I think there's probably a lot of things that have influenced it. And I think that's really interesting for people as well. Like, when do you first remember getting the idea or coming into a space of believing like, okay, I'm going to do a podcast about this? Because I think a podcast has always been on your trajectory, right?
According to you, not for me.
Well, podcasting is like one of the things that I've heard you talking about incredibly passionately. Like the quality of podcasts, the podcasts that you've been dedicated to, like Andrew's podcast, like you've followed podcasts for years. So like it's one of those things that you've always talked about incredibly passionately. So for me, when I listened to you, it was clear that it was on your path once you had a thing to podcast about. And do you remember like the moment or the thing that really made you ready?
Well, I remember a year ago, you said to me, I think you heard me on another podcast, and you said I should be hosting one. And I said no. And that's because I didn't really want to do a podcast about perfectionism or burnout or mindfulness. I don't want to talk about that on a podcast. That just didn't feel as fun for me. And then I didn't really think about it since. And then I remember over the summer, I started thinking I wanted to do more nerdy stuff. I don't remember that shift exactly, but I do remember when it shifted into a podcast. And that was in one of the coaching calls with you in our group, because I said, I want to do this nerdy thing. At first, I was thinking a nerdy bundle, but that still didn't feel fully right. It didn't feel like it was what I wanted. And I said to everybody, what should I do next? And you said, you should do a podcast. And I remember saying, no, I don't want to do a podcast because everybody has a podcast these days. And I have high standards. I didn't want to do something unless it, met the standards in terms of how I felt about podcasts. But then it was that call that you just said I should do a podcast about nerdy things. And then I was like, okay. And it just grew from there.
That's so amazing. We should clip out that part of the call for you for like the future, So, because all those calls were recorded, right? So we should save that for later for posterity. Yeah. The moment that you decided that you were going to do a podcast, what were the things that held you back? What are the fears? I think people who are listening must just be thinking like, Morgan's awesome. She knows how to podcast so easily. She was born with it. There must have been things that were holding you back, or maybe fears. What were you worried about when you started this?
Well, the main thing holding me back in the beginning was just not knowing that it would be a nerdy podcast. Once I knew I would do a nerdy podcast, that felt right. But then moving forward, I had a few fears. Well, one, what if nobody listens? Like, I think that's a fear every podcaster might have. And so it was really important to me to have a topic that I would still enjoy talking about, even if nobody would listen. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love seeing listeners and that there are listeners, but I try to remember that I'm doing this because it's fun, because it really is. I love actually recording the podcast. My other biggest fear, and I think once I got over this, everything else came easily to me, was what the actual topic of the show would be. Because a lot of these nerdy podcasts are either deep dives into specific books or movies, or they have a co-host where they talk about nerdy culture. And neither of those really felt right for me with what I wanted to do, because the deep dives, I just knew that the amount of preparation that would go into it, I just don't know if I would be good at it. Maybe I would in the future, but it just didn't feel right for me. And then I didn't really have a group of co-hosts where we could talk about nerdy things. But then once it sort of came to me that I would want to do interviews of people and their nerdy identities, that felt better. But then I was worried because I was thinking, okay, maybe somebody likes Harry Potter, so they'll only listen to the Harry Potter interviews, but they might not listen to the, I don't know, Neopets interviews or something like that. They might not be interested in other fandoms. So that was a big fear. And I don't think I fully got over that fear until I actually had a few episodes recorded. And I realized that people weren't listening because they were interested in the fandoms, but they were interested in hearing the people's stories and how they spoke about the passions and their nerdy identities. And it became less about the fandoms and more about hearing people's stories.
Yeah, which you're amazingly well placed, really, to host and to hear people's stories and to hold that, I think, from my perspective as a friend, a colleague, a listener. But I wonder, how conscious was that, and how has that been for you as a psychologist? What comes into the podcast from that part of you?
Definitely trying to ask questions that a typical interviewer wouldn't ask. I try to go a little bit deeper or ask about different areas that maybe you wouldn't hear in an interview. The best compliment that I get is that the person tells me those are really good questions that I've never been asked before. And I love that. I think that's the best compliment. I also think I just love hearing people's stories.
What I notice is that your level of engagement is very high, that you research, but you don't necessarily share the same nerdy focus, but that there's some sort of like kindred spirit, shared values, respect.
Yes.
I think that's what I found so kind of engaging, actually, was this like respect for other people's interests. And the question that you ask people that I love so much is, what are you nerdy about at the moment? Because the answers are so surprising to me. They're so surprising. And I've been waiting to ask you that as well. What are you nerdy about at the moment?
So at the moment, I'm definitely nerdy about podcasting. I'm reading a lot about that. But in terms of fandoms, I am, at the time of this recording, I am currently watching Daredevil. That is a Marvel TV show, and I'm watching that because of, well, by the time this episode's out, that episode will have already been out, but I am watching Daredevil because I had two hosts from Vigilante Vibes, a Marvel podcast, on, and so I'm watching that so that I could go on their podcast and give my perspective on the show. I'm also reading the ACOTAR series. I'm about to read book 3. I just finished book 2. For anybody listening, if you know, you know. I loved book 2.
I literally don't know what any of those things are. In fact, what I wanted to say about your podcasting skill is like, I don't listen to podcasts. I'm so sorry. Everyone's going to be horrified when they hear that. I don't listen to podcasts. I also, like, really rarely, you know, and I also don't actually know what the majority of the things are that people are talking about. Like, obviously I've heard about Harry Potter, but I don't know what all the houses are and the,
you don't know what the houses are?
No, I literally don't know.
Oh, okay. I'm like,
I've never
do
read
you know what it means to like be sorted into a house?
Well, I mean, I went to boarding school, so I'm kind of assuming it's like that.
I don't know what boarding school's like. Maybe it's like that. Okay.
I literally don't know. But I have found it incredibly accessible because it's almost like, I mean, and obviously we're therapists here, right? But yes, it's people's passion, but it's also like very, very interesting, you know? It's really interesting what people are passionate about. Like a lot of the time we keep that stuff inside. Like when you meet people, you don't necessarily approach them with, and I love this, and I love this, and I love this, unless you're a famous podcaster, for example, right? But on your podcast, everyone's getting to do that, and you're getting to do that as well. And so people get to I mean, like, I've learned so much about you just from listening to podcast episodes, you know?
Yeah, that was one of my goals too. I wanted to do this podcast so that I could nerd out, and that's why I didn't want to just interview. I tried to view each episode that the person is kind of a co-host with me, and that's a shout out to our friend Maggie, because she's the one who actually gave me that idea to view them as a co-host rather than a guest. And by doing that, I feel like we can both nerd out, and so I could share a little bit more, and I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you've absorbed ideas and taken them on board as you've been building this. And I'm interested, what are the ideas that you have rejected along the way?
At first, I thought this podcast I would invite anybody to talk about anything they're nerdy about. And then I realized I can't have the same passion about some nerdy topics as I would about others. And so I realized I want to focus this show more on stories. So that could be through movies, books, writing, art, theater, like music. I think focusing a little bit more on that rather than some other things that people might be nerdy about. And so I think that really changed. I don't really know any other ideas that I might have rejected. That's a good question. Are you thinking of something?
Yeah, I am. Of course I am. I've always got an agenda. Any other plans or ideas or suggestions that you've gone against the grain, for example?
I might see where you're going here in terms of making this a business. Is that what you're thinking?
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. I remember when I was first talking about this, you know, in that online space, there was a lot of talk about how I could monetize this and create a membership and use the podcast to sell a membership. And I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to make the podcast something that was super fun for me and super fun for people to be on and super fun for people to listen to.
Yeah, I love that. And I don't know if I participated or potentially was the person who was like, how are you going to make money out of this? But at some point, when you were planning it and you had your idea in our group, we talked about like, how are you going to launch? And I had in my head like, there's got to be a big launch runway and like build this up. And you were like, I'm just going to record it next week and just get it out as quickly as possible because I'm on a roll. And I was like horrified. It's like the opposite of everything I've been taught and everything I've learned. And I love that you did that. You know, I love that you did that. And I find your emails are excellent. Your emails have always been excellent. You're an excellent copywriter. It's like always a pleasure to read one of your emails that you send to your mailing list. But the excitement in your emails now is so, so palpable. And I think that like almost everything that you have done since you made a decision to do a podcast has been against the online business grain.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I did some air quotes. I know other people do that too in their episodes.
Okay, so to go back to what you said about the whole launch plan, I remember you said to me that I should do 20 practice interviews. And I was like, no. I mean,
did I?
Yes, you said 20 practice interviews because you said, because I told you how I was interviewing Nicole and Andrew and how much they both meant to me. And you're like, nobody does well in the beginning, practice. And I didn't. I'm really glad I didn't because, oh my gosh, the amount of time that would have taken would have been so stressful. But yeah, I'm just kind of doing what I want and what feels right to me. And maybe that's coming across in the emails as well.
Yeah, I think so. It's so interesting what informs us. I come from this background of like practice. And then you're free to enter the world, And I think what I've seen with you is I'm just going to go and it's going to be natural and fresh and organic. And I really respect that. I really enjoy that. And I think there's a real sort of defiance. So I don't know if you feel that, but it really feels like sort of defiance to me, quite rebellious.
That's so funny. I'm sure some of it probably is because over time, I've grown to really dislike the whole online business world and some of the methods and strategies. I probably did just say, you know what? Like, forget it. I'm going to do what I want to do. I was going to curse and I was like, that means I have to make this episode explicit. And I don't know if I want to make this. Maybe I will. We'll see. This might turn into an explicit episode.
Of course, it'll be the one that I'm on.
I have a few.
Yes, actually. Can you tell us what's been your most successful TikTok reel so far?
Ooh, yes. My most successful TikTok reel so far was with Nicole from Fantasy Fangirls, where she shared how smut has changed her relationship with her husband. I remember I was actually we had Hadestown come to Fort Lauderdale, and so I was going to watch it. And I remember during intermission checking my phone, and I have all of these text messages from my family. We have a little family group chat, freaking out because they see that clip is going, it's not viral, but it's viral for me. They're like, oh my gosh, it's at 23,000 views. It keeps going up. She's in her intermission. When does the play end? When can we talk to her? And I remember leaving and seeing that. And I think now it's up to maybe 58,000. And yeah, super cool. I got a lot of listeners from that reel. So I'm so grateful for Nicole for going there on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. What have been some other really unexpected moments? Like, what did you not expect in the middle of an interview?
I did not expect Erin Pascal from I think it was episode 4, where we spoke about Neopets. She found my old Neopets profile from many, 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 many years ago and read some of the details, which was hilarious. That shocked me. And I don't think I expected to love it as much as I did. I love interviewing. I get to read a book to prep for the podcast. Like, that's so much fun. I'm now watching a TV show to prep for another podcast I'm going to be a guest on. Like, that's so cool. I did not expect any of that. And I did not expect, I know this isn't in the middle of an interview, but I did not expect people to actually like the show. I was really, really worried that people would only listen to one episode of the person they're interested in and wouldn't continue. But I have continuous listeners, which has been really fun.
Amazing. How do you track all that stuff? I don't know anything about podcasting, and maybe people who are listening don't actually know, like, what are your, what are your KPIs? Like, what are you tracking in the podcasting space?
That's a really good question. And I just learned all of this as I was creating the podcast. So I right now am hosting on something called Spotify for Podcasters because it's free. So if you want to start a podcast, by the way, you can do it with minimal financial investment, which is really great. And so what I track typically is the number of downloads per episode within a 30-day period and the number of weekly listeners. That's what I look at the most.
What does it tell you, like, when it changes? Because that's why we track, in business, that's why we track KPIs, key performance indicators, in case anyone's interested. But what does that tell you, like, week to week? What does it tell you about episodes? I mean, can you link that to interest or season or other factors?
Probably. I also look at retention. So how long do people listen to the show for? Let's see. So I think it could tell me if people tend to binge. Because people might not listen when it comes out. They might let a few episodes bank up in their podcast player and then listen to a few at once. I haven't really looked too much into it because it's very technical, but I'm sure over time I'll look into it a bit more.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I guess I was thinking about it from the perspective of our background in online business and getting to know your audience, so to speak. With podcasting, how do you get to know your audience?
That's a great question. I would say emails, if they send me an email, and social media, the interaction there. A lot of podcasters have a Patreon community. And so I've been toying with the idea of having a free Patreon community where people can talk about the episodes and share interests. I just haven't had the time.
That sounds so fun.
Yeah.
So is that how it's typically set up? You have your podcast, people find you through socials, maybe TikTok.
We're the podcast searching platform.
Okay. And then potentially there's some kind of community space where people can chat about what's happened.
A lot of podcasters use Discord.
Oh, okay. I know what that is. Yeah. I know that. Every time you say a word, I feel like going like, I know.
So you said something before. You said you've learned so much about me from listening that you didn't know. What have you learned?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually can't remember do you remember how we met?
Yes. I needed to learn what the laws were with seeing somebody in my practice internationally. And somebody told me to reach out to you. And so I did. And that's how we met.
Yes.
And you were so kind and so helpful.
Oh,
you went above and beyond.
Oh, I try. Thank you. So our first interactions were very much about that kind of work, and it's quite serious. It's all to do with ethics, regulations, doing things professionally, taking care of people and things like that. And so when I was listening to you, it's not that I haven't got to know you over time, because of course we've got to know each other and become friends over time. But this is another side of you where you're much more playful. And of course, we can't really be playful with things like regulations and ethics. And do you know what I mean?
Yeah. But I also think for the past few years, I wasn't as playful as I would want to be, because of just my own personal stuff. I went through a loss, like all of that over the past few years. I don't think I was hiding it from you or people. I think I just wasn't even accessing it much myself. And so I think over the past few months, I've sort of embraced all of that again.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of showed me that there's parts of us that don't make it into our professional spaces a lot of the time. And I hope this does become your, big full-time project, because I think that what's amazing about your guests is that kind of playfulness and that joy has very much, I think Brooklyn quoted Marie Kondo about sparking joy, right? And I think, we don't, a lot of people who'll be listening, it'll be nerding will be their hobby, and they don't necessarily get that playfulness and that joy in their day-to-day or their job. And so that's the kind of stuff that I've learned by listening to you, like a real professionalism, of course, but also playfulness and kind of actual, like a little bit of silliness sometimes as well.
Yeah, like when I told Andrew I used to have a crush on him.
Yeah, exactly. I thought that was really sweet. Do you know what's so funny? I remember you years ago telling me, there's this podcaster and he's so amazing and the quality of his podcast is so great and no one should do a podcast without talking to him, and he even consults. And I remember thinking, I think you might have a crush on him.
He's very not straight, so.
Yeah, no, I got that. I understood that. But I remember thinking like that is a whole level of fandom about podcasting that I had like literally never seen before. And a respect, I think, for the art of podcasting, which I know absolutely nothing about,
Yeah, I've learned that the most important piece is the sound quality. Mm-hmm. And so I try really hard to make sure that it's a nice listening experience, because otherwise people are just going to stop listening.
Absolutely. So how long do you think it takes you to edit each episode?
More than it should take me. And I'm embarrassed to say how long it takes me because I'm way too obsessive. So I would say it could take me 1 hour to 2 hours for every 20 minutes of recording.
I don't think that sounds like that much.
I would say at least 6 hours an episode.
Yeah. It takes me about 6 hours to write a really good email to my subscriber list. It takes me about 6 hours. People will be like, why can't you just knock it out in 20 minutes? And it will be open on my desktop all day if I want it to be really good. So that's just a few hundred words. I can imagine that listening to the nuances and listening to the fillers and editing the flow and everything, I can imagine that it would take that long. Yeah, for sure.
That's something I also do to make my guest feel more comfortable, because if they think I'm not editing, they might feel so stressed out. I know I would feel stressed out, but I let them know, like, say whatever you want. I'll edit out whatever you need me to edit out. And I'm so careful about it. And then it helps them loosen up a bit and feel more comfortable talking because they're not so worried about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because I knew you were editing, I already didn't mind saying every other word. What are the other kind of things that you found really helpful? Like, what are you using to organize your thoughts? What are things that, you know, maybe people wouldn't know about that you're using behind the scenes?
A bunch of Post-it notes and random papers everywhere. I have a dream to have a huge calendar with it all mapped out, and I don't know why. I guess I'm not as organized as I would like to be. I mean, I'm organized in terms of the actual interview process because that involves somebody else. You know, I want to make sure they get what they need. But afterwards, I'm just I'm a little bit of a mess behind the scenes. Something else that I've been doing is I have no shame when it comes to pitching people to be on the show. I will DM and email anybody, huge celebrities. It doesn't mean I'm getting responses, but I have no shame in asking and being very direct and saying that I would love to have them on the show. And I tell them why. I'm very particular with who I reach out to, but I'll ask.
So once you've also got the infrastructure of your actual podcast and amazing guests, I can imagine that it's an easy yes for the majority of people, probably dependent on their availability more than anything else. What about people reaching out to you? What's that been like? People asking to be on the podcast? Because I know that happened because I listened.
Yeah, I've had a few people now reach out, and it's so cool that people actually want to be on my show. So I love that, and I'm so grateful. It's been amazing having people reach out.
Who are the people that you would love to have either back, or who would you like to have on in the future that you haven't had on yet?
Oh, I would love everybody to come back for a part 2. I would love to have the rest of the MuggleCast hosts on, so I could have, you know, all of these people that I've listened to for years. I think that would be amazing. I would love Nick Walker. He played Aaron Burr Hamilton. It would be a dream. I would love to have somebody who has been involved in Back to the Future. That is my favorite movie series of all time. I would love to have somebody who was involved in that on the show. Somebody from The Office, from Bridgerton, you know, all the things that I love.
All of that is so amazing. And who's the ultimate, can't imagine that they do podcasts, like would absolutely love to have them on, would love to meet them?
My mind keeps going to David Tennant. I love David Tennant. I'm actually wearing a Doctor Who shirt, and I did that because, you know, your English accent, and I know Doctor Who is like from there. But I would love to interview David Tennant.
You should just ask him.
I should.
He's super nice. No, I don't know him.
Okay. You just said that.
I know. No, he's super nice. He seems really nice. No, I don't know him. All English people know each other.
I know. I was like, wait a second, Tamara. Do you have a connection?
Sorry. Yeah. I'm so disappointing. I don't know anyone who can be on here.
He's actually going to be at a convention in South Florida in July, and I'm like wondering if I could ask him. Probably not, but you know, it's a dream.
I feel like he just seems like a super accessible kind of guy. I feel like you could somehow get him on somehow. I don't know how. Believe in you, Morgan.
Thank you. Part of me does have a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
We'll see. Maybe eventually. I feel like this podcast was created for me to be able to nerd out about all the things I want to nerd out about. So that's been kind of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing.
What has it been like for you to listen?
It feels really natural. Like, it just feels like I'm listening to you, having a conversation with someone who's really interesting and really cool. And I've always been a fan. Like, before you had a podcast, I've always been a fan. I've hired you to come into my groups and teach them. I've loved having you in other groups, in my bundles. Like, where else can I feature Morgan, you know? And so for me, it's like, it's so easy. I don't hear any awkwardness. Maybe that's a testament to your really great editing skills or conversational skills. Who knows? But it doesn't feel awkward. It feels like very flowing and interesting and interested. And I think there is something really inspiring for people, even if you don't know what a Neopet is. Did I say it wrong?
No, you said it right.
I had to really think about it. No. I have a lot of nerdy people around me in my life, despite not really being a fully fledged one myself. And I actually think that the majority of people find it really inspiring to hear someone talking about something they love, you know? So it's been great for me, you know, listening. I'm not a dedicated podcast listener, but I was really excited to prep for this conversation. And I mean, everyone's been listening in here, so, you know.
What are some of the moments like that have stood out to you while listening?
Some of the things that have really stood out to me are when people have answered about what they were first nerdy about and what they're nerding out about at the moment, because I've actually known some of the things that they have talked about peripherally. And one of the really interesting things for me is that some people have talked about TV shows as a thing that they're nerding out about, Criminal Minds or NCIS or things like that, series. And, you know, years ago, I remember spending the whole of a winter just watching, I don't know what series. I really like American Emergency Services series like Chicago Fire, Chicago PD, etc. Right? Station 19, that kind of thing. Oh, and Grey's Anatomy, you know, those kinds of things. But I have never thought about them as either nerdy or fandoms. But I have thought about them as, I've spent the whole winter watching TV and not doing anything. And I bet you there are so many people out there who are actually engaging in fandoms, engaging in nerdy projects that don't understand that it's a creative pursuit, that don't understand really, you know, so much of the time people tell me like, I spent all day watching TV, or I spent all day listening to this, or I spent all day. And I'm thinking to myself now, well, that's someone's artistic work. That's something that people have obsessed about and deeply learned about and put their entire focus into creating for you. And how dare we dismiss that as a waste of time?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
That's what I've taken from that.
Yeah, you could really have a fandom about anything.
Yeah, so that's been massive. I mean, I remember, you know, I've just watched so much TV, or I haven't done anything today. What do you mean you haven't done anything today? You know, you've absorbed somebody's art.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's true. It is art.
Yes.
And it's taking in these stories that people put a lot of work into. I've probably seen The Office over 10 times.
Really?
I love it.
I think about content consumption and how much we complain about content and how it's so bite-sized and reels, and how is this affecting our attention and things like that. I understand those concerns, but also consuming content in that way means that so many more people have access to little snippets of someone's hard work, of someone's ideas, of someone's creativity. And we don't think of it as micro-learning or connection. We think of it as like wasting time scrolling, doom scrolling. But what if we didn't think about it that way?
I love that. That's so true. People are so quick to write things off because they think it's not good for us. But like they'll say being a fan of something is just an escape, that you're avoiding reality. But I disagree. I think you're right. It's consuming art. It's learning about the human experience, because I think that shows up in any form of media that we consume.
Absolutely. There's something about you talking to people and hearing about what's so inspiring for them. And those things actually save people. We know that in our work, that becoming part of a fandom or identifying with a character in a book or playing a game or connecting with a community saves people.
Absolutely.
Like, and I'm not minimizing it, like saves people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I hadn't really quite put that together until talking to you now about that's why it's so important that you're doing this.
You're going to make me cry. Yeah, it's true. And not just connecting with those stories, but also connecting with a community and knowing that there's other people who these stories matter just as much to as well.
I have got one more question
Okay.
that I think everyone would like to know the answer to. What was the very first thing that you remember being nerdy about?
The very first thing that I remember being really, really nerdy about. I mean, everybody knows I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, but before Harry Potter, well, I think what I really became nerdy about and had a collection of and really loved was the Goosebumps series. I had all of the books. I loved it. I loved the TV shows. I think my favorite Goosebumps book was Welcome to Horrorland. I even the other day looked up R.L. Stine. I was like, I wonder if I could get him on my podcast, but I don't know if that's possible. But yeah, I had all of the Goosebumps books. I loved it.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. Second part of the question. Who at home and in your life has been nerdy, and what were their inspiring nerdy things?
You know, I would say I'm the only nerd like I am. And I think my family was so amazing with supporting me in that, especially with Harry Potter. They didn't read the books, but they went with me to the midnight premiere parties. That was so much fun. We would go, where would we go? We would go to Olive Garden to eat dinner and go to the Barnes & Noble next door for the midnight release party for the Harry Potter books. I loved that. We would go to midnight premieres of movies. So they were super supportive there. And I have to say, my older sisters were super nerdy about 80s hair bands. So I learned, and it's so funny, none of them would identify as nerds, but they were totally nerdy and probably still are about 80s hair bands.
That's amazing. Like, just have such a random passion. But I love that we get known for those things. It's so interesting.
Yeah, but you know, it's so interesting. The community around Harry Potter means so much more to me than Harry Potter.
Yeah, that's what I really took from episode 2. I was really like, wow, that's so amazing to have such a dedicated community. Actually, I found it really interesting, the kind of the emphasis on how inclusive it is and diverse it is.
Yeah, especially with everything that happened with the author that created a lot of heartbreak.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one thing that I've definitely heard in all of your episodes is about the passion transcending difference, that it has actually brought together such diverse communities.
I think so, for sure. Mm-hmm. And realizing that you have connections with people that you never would have realized you would have connections with.
Yeah. Oh, I've got so many more questions now because you've answered questions, and I thought I was going to finish asking you questions, but I've just got still so many more. I'd kind of love to get you to say something about the online business world and what you don't want to bring into this space with you.
I don't want to bring in trying to make everything a sales product. I don't want to bring in trying to follow a specific sort of strategy because other people say that that's the right way to do things. I don't want to bring in marketing tactics that are fake. Oh gosh, I feel like I'm offending people right now.
I mean, is that something that you worry about, that sort of rejecting that and embracing your own plan, that you might offend people?
I mean, I'm a little worried that this might offend some people in the online business world, but in terms of what I'm talking about on the show, I'm not really worried about offending people. I've already had some people comment on social media, you know, criticizing some of the stuff we talk about on the podcast or being a nerd. But honestly, I grew up with the internet and that stuff doesn't faze me. It's kind of, you know, expected at this point, and I kind of love the engagement anyways when that happens in social media.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't asked you about that, but have you had any kind of negativity? Have you?
A little bit. Not much.
What's that like for you? If I put something out there and I get a nasty email, which happens to me more frequently than I'd like, but when I get a nasty email, it really upsets me. I mean, less now than it did a few years ago, but that stuff stays with you. Is it different when you're like, this is my passion? Do you feel like, I don't care what people say,
I haven't been big enough to have any haters really get personal with me. It's always been just about the idea of being a nerd, which is something I've heard my entire life. So that doesn't faze me. So we'll see. Hopefully my podcast grows and I will get those haters. I probably will be happy now if I get some sort of hateful email because it means I made it.
Yeah. Have you made any mistakes yet?
Yes. So my episode with Andrew, during our recording, I had forgotten to ask him what his geeky recommendation was. And we ended the episode and I started panicking like, oh my God, how did I forget this? Now I'm not following my structure anymore. And I was just so embarrassed, but Andrew was amazing. And he recorded it for me. And so I was able to put that into the episode and add that in afterwards.
That's so awesome. Which episode should people listen to if they love TV?
That's a great question. So if you love TV, I would recommend listening to the episode with Michael Metzner. He is a doctor, a medical doctor, and he is also a producer on Grey's Anatomy and Station 19.
Okay, awesome. Which episode should people listen to if they love books?
So we are recording on March 8th. So there's a few episodes between the recording and when this episode comes out. So if I'm leaving out anybody, it's not on purpose. It's because those episodes haven't been released or recorded yet. So if you love books, the episode with Nicole from Fantasy Fangirls, and then we have Andrew Sims' episode from Mugglecast. Erin Pascal's episode, she is a book editor. We have Laura from Mugglecast, her episode. And then, we had an episode with Professor Julian Womble. He teaches a class on Harry Potter and social identity, and he also has an amazing podcast called Critical Magic Theory. And so his episode was great. And then the episode that just came out this week with Brooklyn Quintana, she's an author. So we have lots of book-themed episodes.
Lots of book-themed. Okay, so we've got people who love TV, people who love books. What about music? Have we got any music stuff yet?
We do. We have, as of today recording, we have 2 music-themed episodes. So we have one with Julian Raymond. He's a music producer at a record label. That's a great one. And then we also have one with 2 of my nieces who started a Taylor Swift podcast. So I would suggest listening to that one. And I was so proud of the episode title for that one. I thought of it at 10 o'clock the night before, and I went online and changed the episode title everywhere.
Do you want to share with everyone what it is?
Oh, it's called That Nerd Thing, Taylor's Version. So if you know about Taylor Swift, she's re-recording her albums and, calling them Taylor's Version. And I was like, I have to use that for this podcast episode.
Awesome.
Since this episode comes out on April 1st, I can tell you the episodes that will be coming out between now and then. I mean, people will already know it. So this upcoming Monday, we have would this make sense, though, if this episode comes out after?
This last coming Monday.
Okay.
At some point in March.
I know. I feel like I'm talking to the future, but then when you're listening to this in a few weeks, it'll be the past, the whole time
it's like
thing
Back
going
to the Future. Yeah.
I know, right? So there's a few episodes coming out at the time of this recording. We have Pam from Millennial. I'm really, really excited to have. That means I will have interviewed everybody from Millennial. We have an episode with the Vigilante Vibes podcast. So they're a Marvel podcast. And then we also have an episode with Matt Eicheldinger. He has a book that will have been released by the time this episode is out. I'm really excited for that.
Awesome. Amazing. And I didn't ask about this earlier, but what episode should people go and listen to if they're interested in art or design or graphics or anything like that?
We haven't had an episode specifically focused on that yet, but Brooklyn does mention a bit how she's into graphic design and drawing, so you could get a little bit of that there.
I love that there are themes emerging. And does it feel like the podcast has a life of its own, or has it been very intentional and strategic?
It's definitely been very intentional in terms of me making sure I'm having fun while doing it. There is a little bit of strategy in terms of planning what the show will look like and the sorts of topics I would want to talk about. But it feels like it sort of fell into what it is based on just the interviews themselves and who has said yes to being on the show and the themes.
Amazing. I'm so excited about this project. I think it's like I don't know, the making of Morgan or something, you know? I mean, not that you weren't made already, but do you know what I mean? It gives like it gives us a chance to get to know another part of you. And I think that's pretty cool. Is it important as a nerd to be partnered with a nerd?
I think the most important thing to feel supported in your nerdiness.
Yeah, I love that about what you said about your family, that they really supported the things that you were interested in.
Yeah, I definitely got teased a bit by my sisters, don't get me wrong, but they were also really supportive of it. And they're really supportive of the podcast now.
Yeah.
They always text me every week their reactions to the episode.
That's so nice.
Yeah.
That's so cool. So, and have people in your personal life been supportive? Has everyone been like on board and listening?
Yeah, people who I haven't spoken to in years have reached out saying how they love the show. And that has meant so much to me. And that's so cool.
That is so nice.
Yeah, that probably surprised me the most because, I've been posting on social media for years now about all the online business stuff. But then I post about the podcast and within 2 weeks, I get way more responses and interest in that than I did in the years of all the other stuff I've done.
Isn't that so interesting? That like years of like, how can I help you become mindful? How can I help prevent burnout? How can I actively trying to help, right? And then now you're having fun and people are like, wow, this is so helpful to me.
I know.
What would you say to people like me who don't really identify as nerds, who maybe get into something for a bit of time but haven't really dedicated themselves to a particular fandom? I don't even know if I'm using the word correctly. Is this podcast for all of us?
I think so. I think if you're interested in hearing people's stories and hearing people talk about the things that they're passionate about and to just learn more about the world of being nerdy, then I think the podcast is for you. I mean, I think if you've made it this far, then this podcast is probably for you.
What about for people who are really enjoying following you and listening to you and getting to know you? Like, how can we support you?
Oh, well, just by listening, that's probably the best support that you can give me. Sharing the show with anybody who you think might be interested in it, that is beyond meaningful to me. It means so much to me when people share the show with the people in their lives. Rating and reviewing the show, that does make a difference. I'm really trying not to look at numbers, but the ratings and reviews really do matter on these podcast platforms with showcasing the podcast to people when they're searching for podcasts to listen to. And following and engaging on social media. It's really about getting the word out there. Getting the word out there and listening to the show is the best way that you could help support me and the podcast. And it means so much.
Listen, I've got a practical question that people might not know the answer to, especially if they're a bit older or they don't really listen to podcasts like me, or they're not super techie with apps and things like that. Like, where is the best place to share a podcast from?
So I mainly put the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and then YouTube.
Okay, so potentially someone could go and search for this podcast on YouTube and send someone a YouTube link.
Yes. You could send a YouTube link. And also from Spotify and Apple, there's little dots where you could click it and click share that show. And then there's a link to the show.
Awesome. So you could share like a particular episode that you really like, or you could just share the show generally. What I do is I just tell people about it. I just say it all the time. Aww. And my friend Morgan has this really cool podcast. It's all about being nerdy. It's called That Nerd Thing. Oh, and that brings me to another final question, which is, how did you come up with the name?
Oh, okay. So I definitely have to give credit to my husband here. I was talking about wanting to do this podcast for a few weeks and I couldn't come up with a name. I started listing all these names.
I've got a list somewhere. We talked about it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think I was thinking like...
What were we thinking?
Nerds Uncovered, Nerds Unveiled, like something like that. Because I wanted something with mystery.
Yeah.
And I think... I was just talking to him and I kept saying, you know, like that nerd thing I'm doing, the nerd thing I'm doing. And he's like, why don't you just call it that? And then I think I messaged you and I was like, what do you think about like the nerd thing or that nerd thing? And you're like, yes, that nerd thing. And I just went with it. And I kind of like it because it's what I kept calling it just in conversation. And then it also is kind of playing on the fact that people would write off nerds for so long. Like, oh, it's just that nerd thing. But it's like, oh, it's that nerd thing. I love it.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you said it, I remember actually you sent me a text with it, and I remember thinking, well, yeah, obviously that's what it's called. You know, like, oh, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Whereas all the other ones, do you remember I was a bit like, I don't know, keep looking.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely shout out to my husband there, because I would not have had that name without him.
Yeah, well, both of you together, right?
Yeah.
He just reflected back to you what you were already doing.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good teamwork.
Yeah. He really wants to be on an episode of the show, so maybe he'll make an appearance one day.
That would be cool for everybody to learn more about you. I remember when you first started talking about that nerd thing and showing me some of the artwork and how you were going to present it visually. So how did you come up with all of that?
That was definitely a team effort between myself and my nieces. Two of my nieces who did the Taylor Swift podcast, they gave some input, but really the one who created this was my niece, Skylar. She basically created this artwork from scratch, and I just sort of threw out ideas and my vision that I wanted to seem like magical and have little fandom symbols, and she drew it all.
That's amazing. And you know, when someone creates something and it fits so well, and even during the process, like you shared a little bit with me, like, oh, what do you think about this? And oh, what do you think about that? And a little bit like the name at the beginning, I was like, okay, let's see how it goes. And then when it was finished, it was like, oh yeah, well, obviously this is how it was meant to look. You know, everything just fits so well. So amazing job done by your niece.
I probably drove her crazy with all of my demands and questions and little tweaks, but she was an amazing sport and she got that done fast. Because, you know, I didn't start thinking about doing this podcast until I think it was the either end of October, sometime in November, like from everything from November and December, it was created and launched in January.
It was so quick. It was so quick, you know, because we were meeting last year in our group. I think we literally had like 2 calls, maybe 3 calls tops. And you were like, I'm recording next week.
I know.
Yeah, amazing how quickly this got off the ground. It's one of those things, it's like the way that I think about art, I mostly think about this with music, but I'm just going to transpose it onto this, is that it already exists. And that like this podcast already existed and that you are the conduit for us to access it. And so when everything fits, it's like you've slotted in, you know, you're like in the pocket, so to speak. When you've got the name and then you've got the artwork and then you've got the guests and everything kind of works and all the ideas flow, and it's like, and it's easy for you. It sounds like it's easy for you. You're a great interviewer. You're a really strong host. You've got a great topic. And you're also a great interviewee, as I'm finding out.
Thank you so much. I really also have to give credit to everybody who has been there with me as I've been working on this. I could not have done it alone. I would have never done a podcast if you didn't tell me, hey, do a podcast. And, you know, all the stuff over the years that you've helped me with that kind of led me to this point. My husband with the topic and the extreme support because he's also a major nerd. And then my nieces, we have our little group chat going because they have their podcast, and my other niece who did the artwork. And then my family is so supportive. And then I consulted with both Nicole and Andrew because they're podcast experts, and I wanted to learn from the experts before I started. And they were amazing. I could not have done the show without them. And then actually getting them as guests, by the way, which I was so happy when they said yes. And then the rest of the guests that I got on the show, like this show would not be a thing without the amazing people on the podcast. Oh, and the listeners, obviously, the fact that people are actually listening and want to listen, just I'm so incredibly grateful for just the community that has come from this podcast itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And your listeners, it's not just like me and your friends. There are people out there who like you haven't met who are fans of your podcast.
I was going to say, yes, there's people who have listened to my podcast, but to think that there are fans, like that's super cool.
Yeah. Have you had any cool feedback or comments?
I've just had a lot of people in my life who I haven't spoken to in years messaging me about the show and how cool it is and how they're sharing it with the other nerdy people in their life. And that's been amazing. And then I've had a few social media messages and emails, and that's been really, really nice to receive too. I mean, I'm human. I love feedback.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess that's kind of one thing I was going to say. You told us about how we can support you in terms of listening and following, but also if people wanted to give you feedback, can they email you?
Oh, yes. Please email me any of your thoughts about any of this at thatnerdthingpod@gmail.com. You could also message me. I'm on Instagram and TikTok at thatnerdthingpod. I'm really active on social media as well.
Yeah, and bonus points if it's positive feedback.
I know. You asked me if people can email feedback, and I was just like, oh boy, hopefully it's not, I welcome all comments, but yes.
Tell Morgan who you loved hearing on the podcast.
Oh, I would love, yes. I would, please email me.
You know what people could do? Ooh, if there's people who can hook you up with...
Oh my gosh, I know.
If anyone knows David Tennant, email Morgan.
Or anybody in Bridgerton, The Office, Doctor Who, Back to the Future, Harry Potter, really anything.
All the things, email Morgan. Hook her up.
Oh my gosh, I would love that.
Or if you have suggestions, I've already sent suggestions of like all the nerdy comedians that I want you to.
Oh, I've DM'd them. I will DM anybody if I'm like, oh wait, I like this person. I want them on the show. I'm reaching out.
Essentially, like all the comedians that I've got crushes on, I'm like, they're a bit nerdy. Morgan, contact them.
Well, if any of them say yes, I'll be sure to let you come be a guest on the show and at least say hi to them.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tamara, for being here and interviewing me and for having this conversation where I could open up a bit more. I so appreciate you being here so that I didn't have to do a solo episode myself. And really, everybody, this podcast would not exist without Tamara. Because Tamara literally said, you should do a podcast. And if she never would have said that, I don't think I would ever have done a podcast. So thank you, Tamara.
Oh, thank you so much for having me and for giving me so much credit in this story. If it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else. For sure, the podcast was always going to exist. I'm so happy it's out there in the world. And I'm so happy that I got a chance to be on the podcast, even though I don't meet the criteria and I'm not a true nerd yet.
Yeah, I think you're a true nerd. I just think you haven't discovered that you are a true nerd yet, but I think you will. Tamara, do you have any message that you would want to share with listeners before I wrap up the show?
Only send nice emails. And thank you for listening to us.
Do you want to plug anything?
No.
Okay, everybody. Tamara doesn't want to plug anything, and that's...
No, but I tell you what, I've really enjoyed interviewing you for your podcast. So if other people would like me to come and interview them for their podcast, I'll be happy to do that.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. And let's see. I mean, I kind of did the outro, the stuff I typically say throughout the episode. So yeah, just thank you for listening. Please feel free to reach out to me, and I will see you all next time. Bye.